This is an RNZ podcast.
They say it takes a village to raise a child. I'm Kathryn Ryan, and here we draw on my conversations with experts on 9 to Noon to help you navigate family life. And don't forget you can email questions to our next guest in Parenting Today, 9 to Noon at rnz.co.nz, text them to 2101 or tweet them at 9 to Noon. We're looking at the importance of food for babies and toddlers, with nutritionists saying choose a chicken dinner over chicken nuggets. Registered dietitian Clare Wall leads the nutrition and dietetic department at the University of Auckland's Faculty of Medical and Health Sciences. She's been involved in the Growing Up in New Zealand longitudinal study, which has followed children from birth to 11 years old. The research has provided a valuable snapshot of what Kiwi kids are consuming, including that 50% of 9-month-olds had eaten junk food. Professor Wall stresses the importance of early nutrition and aims to find ways to support parents to ensure babies have an optimal diet to get the best start in life, to develop good eating habits and to help prevent obesity. Claire, good morning and welcome back to 9 to Noon.
Oh, Morena, Kathryn, thank you for having me on the show.
Could you explain a little bit more about the research that's been happening and what's prompted it?
Well, we have this wonderful cohort study called Growing Up in New Zealand, and basically the study has followed women when they were pregnant, over 7,000 women. They were 28 weeks pregnant, and their offspring who are around 11 years of age now, and we've been very fortunate to get information on the women when they were pregnant, but also on the children during this time on what they eat. And so we've been able to kind of track their eating habits and look at some of the factors that are associated with those eating habits over time. And this is really important in the New Zealand context, particularly in infants, because we have very little information in New Zealand on what babies eat. We've got small cross-sectional studies around the country, but not on this kind of scale. We've got very good breastfeeding data that we collect, that Plunkett collects and the ministry collects, but we don't really have much information on what babies are eating.
So there's a lot of children surveyed here. You got a really good picture. More than 6,000, I think, children surveyed by the age of 9 months old.
Yeah, absolutely. Nearly 6,500.
Yeah. So what did it reveal for you? What were the standouts?
Well, what we sort of wanted to look at was what babies were being fed and how that compared to what we recommend them to be fed. So in New Zealand, we have the Ministry of Health guidelines, food and nutrition guidelines for different ages and stages. And so we compared what they were eating to these guidelines, and we sort of created a score, if you like, taking into account the different indicators in the guidelines. And what we found, the top score that could be achieved was 100, and we found that not very many babies were achieving the perfect score of 100. 70 was the average score, and almost a third, though, of the cohort scored 80 or more. So that was really good. What we found that, I suppose the research found that infants had high adherence to about 5 of the 13 feeding indicators considered in the study. But some of the kind of things that I suppose that we did find were that about 50% of the 9-month-old had eaten sweets and chocolate and hot chips and potato crisps and things that aren't generally recommended for infants to eat by the time they were 9 months of age. And also about a third of them were eating fruits and veggies twice a day, but not as many as we would like, or as many as that was recommended by the Ministry of Health.
Could we get a little bit more specific then about, to get a high score or to get a low score, what do you regard as some of the essentials? What were you looking for in a good, healthy nutrition for a baby this age?
Well, they were based on the indicators were based on what the Ministry of Health recommends. So that includes the breastfeeding recommendations. So the recommendation is to exclusively breastfeed babies to around about 6 months of age, and then continue breastfeeding to at least 1 year and 2 years and beyond as mum and baby wishes. To introduce solid foods around 6 months of age, and then there's a recommendation of the different types of solid foods, and particularly around introducing fruits and vegetables, introducing protein-based foods before 7 months of age, And so there's quite a number of indicators that we use to develop the index for this study. And also not only sort of foods that should be introduced, but the sorts of foods that we recommend aren't introduced, particularly adding sugar to foods or foods with added sugars in them, and also foods that contain salt or adding salt to food. So there are some of those other indicators as well that were included in our score.
Do you learn any more? Like, I'm not sure how detailed or the nature of the research, but do you learn any more about the situations in which babies this young might have had sweets or crisps, and how often, and why perhaps? Is it sometimes used to soothe, or do we learn any more qualitatively?
Yeah, so we did have some indicators in our research. I mean, I just think that we basically found that these foods were introduced and in different groups introduced more often, or the babies were having them more frequently than in other groups. And I mean, it's hard, isn't it? Because I think that if you're consuming them as part of a family or at home with other people in the house, then if other people are eating them, then often maybe people feel it's okay to introduce or give a little bit of these foods to babies, but it's something that obviously we recommend doesn't happen, because babies already have a very innate taste for sweet stuff, particularly because of his breast milk is very, very sweet. And it's probably, in the past, it's a bit like with salt. It's an evolutionary thing that we craved sweet stuff and salt as a means of survival, whereas now we live in an environment where sweet foods and salty foods are plentiful, and so we now need to have to think about limiting those sorts of foods that we give for all of us, but particularly that they're inappropriate to give to babies. We don't want to develop their sweet or salt tooth any further, because they already have that, and we don't need to encourage it or the liking for those foods.
It's similar to a lot of the research that's been done, and I'm not sure if there's an overlap about antenatal mum's diet and before birth when pregnant. And I know people get fed up with hearing it in some ways. It's like mums can't catch a break. But if you think about Sir Peter Gluckman's work and the Liggins Institute work, there's clearly a connection in what carries on through life. And I'm not sure whether these early months are equally very important for the nutritional trajectory, or certainly the health trajectory. Do we have an overlap between the two?
Totally. I mean, they are. It's just a trajectory, as you quite rightly say. It is a continuum from prenatal, during pregnancy, and during the first 2 years of life. We often coin that the first 1,000 days. And we see that nutrition is important across those whole first 1,000 days in terms of ensuring optimal growth and development, but also eating behaviour. As that work in the Liggins has proven the importance of prenatal nutrition and antenatal nutrition, we also know that it's incredibly important in the first 2 years of life as well.
Did you mention with salt there's a particular issue with infants this young, that their kidneys aren't really formed developed yet to be dealing with salt or much salt?
So when a baby's born, their kidney function isn't as developed as an adult, and so it's still developing during that first year of life. And when we eat too much salt, as an adult, we're very good at regulating the amount of salt that's in our body, and we excrete excess salt that we don't need. And so a baby their kidneys aren't quite up to that level of being able to do that. So if they consume too much salt, they're not so able to excrete it. And so they can have, issues with higher levels of sodium, which can be a problem both immediately but also long term.
You mentioned that first 1,000 days. We know it's so vital for so much brain development. It really sets up so much for a newborn and for a young baby, such a pivotal start of life. When it comes to nutrition, what is it that is most needed, and then in what foods and in what kind of balance of foods is this to be found? Because we know that feeding infants and toddlers for that matter can be particularly challenging, and there's a lot of people who try and assist with different strategies for trying to get the right nutrition. But what is it that is optimal for babies and for toddlers through in those first 1,000 days?
It's a really, really good question, and I totally agree with you. There's a lot of parents really want to do the best for their infants and their toddlers and their children, and there's a lot of information out there, and there's a lot of it, parents just do their best, and there's a lot of guilt around that, and I'd hate to kind of put more pressure on parents. I mean, in terms of optimal nutrition, I think that the guidelines, the Ministry of Health guidelines really, which are evidence-based, are very clear that we know that breastfeeding provides the best start in life, and if possible to try and exclusively breastfeed babies to around 6 months of age and then start introducing solids is the kind of optimal form of feeding, and continued breastfeeding in the first year of life if possible. In terms of the foods, it's recommended that babies are introduced to cereals, fruits and vegetables and protein-based foods quite quickly from 6 months of age when they're introduced to foods, but also from ensuring that the texture is correct. So from going from purees to soft lumps to harder textured foods. So that's also quite important in terms of development, getting them onto the right textured foods. And then as they progress onto a greater variety of foods, just ensuring that those foods, again, aren't highly processed with regards to having a lot of salt or sugar in them, or some of the more unhealthier fats. And then as through the first year of life, getting into the second year of life, again, encouraging healthy eating habits, which are kind of more than adopting the family eating habits and family eating environments. And so, again, that's sort of looking at trying to ensure that, toddlers have plenty of a variety of foods, including fruits and veggies, whole grain cereals, protein sources, which could be meat-based or non-meat-based if people are vegetarian or vegan, and ensuring that they also get a good calcium source, so dairy products or the equivalent. So it's really getting them onto the variety of foods to ensure that they get all the nutrients that they require, and getting them to develop the right eating habits, if you like, and particularly in that first year of life, getting them onto the right textured foods as well. In terms of brain development, 80% of the brain develops in the first 2 years of life. So the brain is requiring huge amounts of energy and huge amounts of nutrients to develop appropriately. And some of the key nutrients there, particularly, is iron. And so we know that iron is taken up in those by the brain in those first 2 years of life, and is really important for optimizing brain function. And so foods that contain good, amounts of iron, obviously meat is a really good source of iron, but if people don't eat meat, then ensuring that infants and toddlers get appropriate meat, iron-rich foods, such as green leafy vegetables and cereals and pulses and legumes.
As well as solid food for babies, did you also look at breastfeeding and at formula in this 6,500 strong group?
Yes, we sure did. So we tried to understand about the exclusivity of breastfeeding, so how many babies were exclusively breastfed for 6 months as per the Ministry of Health guidelines, and then how many of them went on to continue on to be breastfed, and then how many of them also consumed formula. So one of the main things that we found in this study was about 15.8% of the infants were exclusively breastfed for 6 months. So the target is around about 50% exclusively to 6 months. So that's still reasonably low. What we did observe, though, was that there was a really good initiation rate to breastfeeding. So about 98-point-something% of these infants started breastfeeding in life. It's just that it started to tailor off over a certain period of time. One of the key reasons for that is returning to work. So, parents having to return to work and finding it difficult to continue breastfeeding, and also having other dependents to look after.
All right. What is your view on the commercial baby food pouches? Going back to what we were saying earlier, that you're not wanting to have too sweet a tooth, you're not wanting to really trigger those salt and sweet drivers any more than they're innately programmed. What was your view on the use of the commercial baby food pouches and what goes in them?
Yeah, so this is creating a lot of interest globally at the moment. There's quite a lot of people doing research trying to look and understand about the pouches. So I suppose the pouches have come about for convenience issues. So obviously it's really preferable to go back to basics with baby food and, make your own at home, etc. But we've also got to recognise the practicalities of this. So convenience foods does have a place, but it's how much is used and the sorts of convenience foods that are used for babies. And I think the biggest concern about the pouch is because of the pouch format is that the stuff that goes into the pouch tends to be pureed or very soft mush. And so what research around the world has shown is that babies are being fed these for quite long periods of time. They're also being fed them out of the pouch, so babies are given them to suck on, if you like, which isn't recommended. It's actually recommended that the mush is squeezed out of the pouch into a bowl, and then baby either feeds themselves or they're fed with a spoon, etc. So there is this concern about the overuse, the long-term use of the pouches, and the types and the lack of texture of food that's being consumed through these pouches. The other concern about that is if you're eating a lot of puree food or a lot of mush and you're not having to chew much, it's very easy to overeat. So it's very easy to eat more than you ordinarily would if you were chewing the same sort of food, but it was a different texture. So the University of Otago is actually just about to start a study to look more closely at this and to look at how that issue around chewing or lack of chewing can impact oral motor development. So that will give us some greater insights, I think, in New Zealand. But there's quite a lot of research around the world looking at this.
One of your simple points is don't go for the chicken nugget. It's, go down to a chicken that has been cooked, or a chicken piece that has been cooked on the oven preferably, rather than going to the fast food version, which may have things added, a lot of things added. I wonder I wonder what you do. Having learned what you've learned here, what's the best approach? Is it an education approach often? Is it just trying to make sure that people have got the best information? Not everyone's got the chemistry backgrounds to know exactly what they're going to get from this or that food. What's the best way to practically help while also accepting people are under time pressure? They're going to do things sometimes that are suboptimal but are part of doing what they've got to do in life. What's the best way to use this information to support parents?
I really agree with those points. I mean, we have the optimal situation or the recommendations, but then we have to, operationalise those. And everybody, as you say, tries to do their best and wants to feed their babies the best, and young children. But there are the practical elements. I mean, people are really busy. We are much more dependent now on convenient foods and eating away from home, and therefore not as likely to know what's in our food. And food isn't just about providing us with nutrition and health. I mean, food also has a very vital and important role in providing us with, a social function, as well as, for pleasure. We don't just eat because we know that eating a food is going to provide us with nutrition and health benefits. So we have to take all of those things into account. And so I think, we need to do the best for our babies and young children as we can, but we also need to be realistic about it. And so therefore there is a place for some convenient foods in early nutrition, but it's how often we use it and then the types of convenient foods that we're using and feeding to our babies. So to me, it would be, obviously trying to limit the amount of foods that are high in salt and high in sugar, added sugars to infants and young children, trying to limit those, trying not to use sweet foods as a reward or for comforting children so that their eating behaviour doesn't become associated with those emotions as well. And then thinking about variety, just in trying to provide a varied diet where possible. is also really important to try and ensure that babies and young children are getting all the nutrients that they require. But I mean, this is something that we all need to own. It's not, it's around access. So for a lot of parents, having access to that information and having access to those healthy foods so that they can provide those to their infants and children, which is a much larger issue for New Zealand. We can educate at an individual level and provide information and support, but actually it's also about the environment that our infants and children are being brought up in and how we can best improve that environment so that they have better access to healthier foods. I think that's also really important.
Thank you very much. That is Clare Wall, registered dietitian, leads the Nutrition and Dietetic Department at Auckland University's Faculty of Medical and Health Sciences and has been involved in the Growing Up in New Zealand longitudinal study.